It is a very beautiful morning out here. I wonder how many of you have gone down into the Pasadena Mall and seen the display they have on childbirth. I think they have, I haven't seen it myself, but I just learned before services that they do have it there, and the different stages of pregnancy displayed in a very, a very informative way, so that we can understand just how pregnancy does take place and how the fetus or how the embryo develops into the fetus and finally comes to the time of parturition. I think it would be very helpful in light of what I preached about 2 weeks, well, I did preach 2 weeks ago on the subject of abortion and how it affects humanity. How many of you have a deep resentment or bitterness toward your own parents? I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I want you to reflect on some things here as I preach again what I call part 2 of this 2-part sermon on the unborn child. But there is a deep resentment on the part of some children who are now adults against their own parents. Bitterness. Also, there is deep resentment and bitterness on the part of parents toward their children in many cases. And when you have this kind of a relationship, have you ever asked yourself, how can you fulfill and carry out the commandment from God that says, honor your father and your mother? How can you do it? Can you fulfill that commandment? Have you ever wondered why young children... Now this came to me while I saw the choir singing just a few minutes ago. And I wondered how many children of these singers grow up to be singers themselves. But have you ever wondered why young children of Spanish descent, of Swedish descent, Scottish descent, Irish descent, and so on down the line, have learned to dance those national folk dances so easily? You watch those little children out there, and they're just dancing their hearts out, just like the adults are. And have you ever wondered why it is that they have picked up on those dances so easily, so enthusiastically? I have marveled over that. I never taught my children to dance, because I never knew how to dance myself. But how much effect has the dancing of the parents had upon their children? Have you ever noticed, sometimes if you know the people quite well, that this woman or that woman in the dance troupe is pregnant, but she hasn't given up the dancing? She enjoys the dancing. She gets out there and dances probably up until about her 6th or 7th month of pregnancy. She's carrying a child in her womb, but she does not refrain from doing those things that are enjoyable to her. What kind of an influence does that have on the embryo or the fetus in her womb as she is going about dancing and enjoying her life? Now we know that the unborn child is programmed to love dancing long before it is born. We have irrefutable proof that a child can learn a song that the mother has sung only while she was pregnant and never again after the child was born. We have the record of individuals who are famous musicians who wondered why they knew the musical strains of a song they had never played before. It just came right out as soon as they turned the pages of the music for the first time to conduct their own orchestras or their own music ensembles. They knew the song right straight through, and they'd never heard it before in their lives. And when they inquired of their mothers and found out and gave the mother the name and the title of the special piece, she recalled that she was playing that music for a special concert And once that concert was over, she never played it again. But she was practicing day in and day out, and she was pregnant with this unborn child, who later became the musician that used that song later on, or those songs. It's interesting. In the first sermon I brought 2 weeks ago, I made the statement, and I was quoting from Dr. Thomas Burney, from his book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, quoting, "The unborn child is a feeling, experiencing, remembering being who responds to and is deeply influenced by his environment, that is, his mother's womb." Now, God's purpose for us, we all know, all of us in God's church, God's purpose is to reproduce himself. That's why he created man out of the dust of the ground, to develop in him the kind of character that he possesses. And it's a long lifetime process to bring us around to that stage where we can ultimately be born into his family, that joyous occasion that is so remarkable that most human beings everywhere, I would say all human beings except those in God's church, do not understand it. When we turn back to Genesis, the first chapter in verse 26, we read where God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea," and so forth. Then dropping down to verse 28, noting here that he is in the process then of adding to his family. He already is a family. At this point, there is God and the Word forming a family, the God family. But now in verse 28, notice another directive that he has given. After he had created them, he said in verse 28, Genesis 1, verse 28, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.'" Just fill the earth with your offspring. I want many sons born into glory. Turning over to Genesis, the 3rd chapter then, we read the account of the first man and woman failing in the first test that they were put to, whether or not they would obey God and follow in his steps, or whether they would succumb to the wiles of Satan the devil. And we know the story. They rejected God, they took up Satan's way, and the result was the violence that began to erupt almost immediately in that family, that first family. The violence of man against man. In Genesis, the 4th chapter, the very first offspring, it says, was Cain, of that union of man and woman. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bore Cain, and said, "I have gotten a man from the eternal." Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. We know the story of how they began to give their offerings, and Cain's offering was not pleasing to God. He was going the way, as they say, of Cain today. He was going the way of his forebears, his parents. But Abel brought an offering that was pleasing to God. Now, what was the result? He was angry, Cain was angry, and God said to him in verse 6, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door." So God warned Cain, gave him a double warning, partially from his parents' example, and then a direct warning from himself. "And its desire is for you, or toward you, but you shall rule over it if you take charge." Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, verse 8, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. The first murder, the first human being to die, as a result of turning away from God in his way, succumbing then as a whole society, a whole world turned toward Satan in his way. Now let's turn back to a statement that David made in the 139th Psalm. In the 139th Psalm, David made some statements here that are marvelous. And I think we need to concentrate our attention on just what David was saying here a little bit more than we normally do. The 139th Psalm, verse 13, 14, 15, we could go on. But in verse 13 he says, "For you," talking to God, "you, God, have formed my inward parts. You have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame," notice now he says, "my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." Every part of him was known as he was developing within the womb of his mother, the wife of Jesse. "Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they are all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them." In other words, he was not conscious of day and night in his mother's womb. Were you, in your mother's womb, conscious of day and night? I can tell you from authoritative research that has been done that you were conscious of light and darkness in your mother's womb. A bright light shined against her abdomen would have caused you to put your hands, even in 4th and 5th month, along as a fetus in the mother's womb, put your hands over your eyes to screen your eyes from the bright light, and then take them down again. And if a loud noise is popped against the mother's belly or outside the mother's abdomen, the baby recoils against it and heartbeat increases. And they have tested that and proved that. So David was remarking about the very things that oftentimes our doctors, most doctors do not recognize some of the things about the child that is unborn in its mother's womb. Now we have we have a paradox of medical science. Medical science is supposed to be in the vanguard of all knowledge, showing us how to live our lives and how to direct our lives, and yet they have very, very little awareness of exactly what they are doing. They have two approaches. There is the approach to save a life and to preserve life, to keep life going, that puts life support systems on the elderly long past the time that God would give them to live. Now we have the case of baby Faye, dead after 3 weeks of life, sustained by an operation, and I cringed every time I saw on television that long, kind of a rust-colored scar going almost from the clavicle up here down to the belly button of that child as it was nursing. But now baby Faye has died. They failed in their desire to try to find a way to preserve life. They battle. Millions and billions of dollars are expended to train people, to teach people, to research in laboratories to try to find ways to preserve life. Now that's one aspect of medical science. Now the paradox is the other approach is abortion. They deliberately take away life. Isn't that a paradox? On one hand, they try to save life, and how many millions of parents out there where the mothers are barren the wives are barren and can have no children, they are clamoring to adopt children. And yet the doctors deliberately abort life before it is born. That life in the mother's womb is not just some, as one doctor put it, mindless tissue within the mother's womb. That's the way the doctors like to approach it. They're afraid to approach it any other way. It's not just some mindless tissue to be discarded painlessly, but I want to focus now on the effect that it has on children and on you adults and what has happened in your life. There is a pamphlet that I read put out by an anti-abortion group, and the pamphlet's entitled Children, Things We Throw Away, raises a question. Now, doctors have what they call the Hippocratic Oath. Have you ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath that the doctors are supposed to adhere to before they are permitted their license to practice medicine? Today, the anti-abortionists are calling it the hypocritical oath, because the doctors, for the most part, are not following the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath has this statement, and this is what they promise and pledge to do. I will give, quoting from the Hippocratic Oath, I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest such counsel. And in like manner, I will not give a pessary to produce abortion. Did you know that was in the Hippocratic Oath that the doctors swear to, pledge allegiance to? And this Hippocratic Oath is hundreds and hundreds of years old. And yet all doctors are required to pledge that. Now, the human embryo in a mother's womb is a living human being, contrary to what many doctors would like to believe. Made in God's likeness, not something to be discarded by a doctor or by any other abortionist. And many women have tried to abort themselves. To abort the baby that they find themselves pregnant with. Many thousands of women have tried that. When they discovered an unwanted pregnancy, they've tried to abort that child. We have records of individuals who went into sitz baths, sat down in sitz baths, hot sitz baths, trying to abort their child, unaware that their child knows their feelings and knows the attitude of their mother toward that life of theirs. I wonder if we can realize, brethren, and this is what I'd like to get across to all of us, is that we have a glorious opportunity to turn lives around in this God's church. Not only in love to parents, but in profound love toward God. And we have that opportunity now, beginning now, in the present generation that we are in at the present time. Our children are privileged and blessed so greatly to be children that are in that transitional generation. They're sitting right here, our children. Some of you are pregnant, you women, and you have the opportunity to begin now to develop that child in your womb so that it will be a happy, fulfilled, balanced individual going on into God's kingdom to be very fruitful in that kingdom in serving the great God. Back in Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, in verse 7, we have a directive here again from God. In Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, here's God's injunction to all of Israel. And we are spiritual Israel today. We are the church of the living God. So we might word it this way. Hear, you people in God's church. The eternal, our God, the eternal is one. You shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Your heart is where you have your seat of emotions, and your attitude is formed. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way. Now, it doesn't say just talk to your children after they're born. It means to talk as a family about these directives that God has given to you, so that the unborn child in the womb can hear the conversation. And believe me, they can hear. Too much research now to deny it. When you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, and you might say, when you're dancing your folk dances, singing the songs, dancing to the rhythm of the music. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gate. Then in verse 20, it says, when your son asks you, now after the birth of that son, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, the judgments which the eternal our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Eternal brought us out of the land, out of Egypt, with a mighty hand. And the Eternal showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe, against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all his household. Now over in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, let's go over there to verse 12. The Israelites coming out of Egypt could only see very dimly what God was working out. They didn't have the full comprehension of what God was doing, yet they were the children of God. They were the children of Israel. In the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, we have here what we call the love chapter, don't we? But notice down in verse 12 rather, for now we see in a mirror dimly. We're only seeing, even those of us in God's church, dimly the great expanse of God's purpose and plan for us throughout all the universe and all eternity. The children of Israel coming out of Egypt had even more dimly a vision of what God was trying to work out. They little understood what God was trying to turn out. A child in our mother's womb does not understand the full import of everything that is in the future for it, any more than we have any great understanding of what God is going to do with us after the 100-year period following the 1,000-year reign of Christ and all of us in the millennium. Here he says, for now we see in a mirror dimly or darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I am also known. And so abide faith, hope, love, these three. The greatest of these is love. And here again we're touching on a subject that God wants implicitly implanted into our minds, in our children's minds. Then back in Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, another very powerfully used scripture that we've used for many, many years. In the 22nd chapter of the book of Proverbs, in verse 6, all our training manuals and articles have focused around this verse, where it says in Proverbs 22, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, I don't think it reads that way in your Bible, but that is really what it means. It doesn't mean that he's going to depart from it as we used to think. I used to think that he would probably irrevocably throw aside God's way for a number of years, and then when he was old, he would turn around and come back because he had it ringing in his mind. But it doesn't say that. It says, if we train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. He will live by it right on through until he's an old individual, and will even then live by it and not depart from it. I think we can take heart from that, and we can begin to instruct our children appropriately and powerfully. But notice, Satan's method is to expose us to so much violence today that our sensitivity is dulled. It's almost as though he is causing to be shown on television and all the movies that you see such violence, and then seeing it in the encounters of our police departments with the violence on the street, sometimes in our own very neighborhood. So much that we say kind of ho-hum, when are they going to show us something even more violent? I've seen everything of every quality. So our sensitivity is being dulled. And brethren, it better not be dulled much further. We better become aware. We have to beware, brethren, of searing our consciences our conscience, because searing our conscience is likely to take place if we are off guard like Esau was. Now that's in the Bible for a reason. Esau despised his birthright because he saw through the glass darkly what God was working out in his life. So he despised his birthright. He sold it for a little bowl of soup. That marvelous birthright. Later on in his life, when he realized what he had done, his vision had expanded to the place where he could understand a little bit more, he sought it again with tears. And God says he could not find repentance at that time. His conscience was so seared that he could not find his way back to the right kind of repentance. Now I want to take note of some things here. Take note of how an experienced abortionist succeeded in closing his mind to abortion. He steeled himself deliberately. This abortionist set about to follow the practice of other doctors. Once he got his shingle hung out, he's licensed to practice, and he steeled himself until he was able to abort. And I'm going to read some of the things that he wrote. But another doctor, this doctor is Dr. Nathanson, and I mentioned him 2 weeks ago. Dr. Nathanson succeeded in turning away from that very lucrative practice, but not until he had supervised 60,000 abortions and performed 7,000 abortions with his own hand. He finally saw the light and had the courage to turn away from those thousands of dollars that were available to him through abortion. Now this doctor, who was finally became an experienced abortionist, succeeded in closing his mind. His name is Dr. John Zenens. S-E, let me start it all over. It's a peculiar name. I don't know what nationality it is. S-Z-E-N-E-N-S. Zenens. Dr. John Zenens. He made this statement: you have to become a bit schizophrenic. In one room, you encourage the patient that the slight irregularity of the fetal heartbeat is not important, that she is going to have a fine, healthy baby. That's on one hand. Then, in the next room, you assure another woman on whom you just did a saline abortion that it is good that the heart is already irregular. She has nothing to worry about. She is not going to have a live baby. Then he continues, quoting from him, one noticed that at the time of the saline infusion, there was a lot of activity in the woman's uterus. It wasn't fluid currents. It was obviously the fetus being distressed by swallowing the salt solution and kicking violently through the death trauma. End of quote. How stoical does a man have to become in order to do something like that and witness something like that? So later he confesses how he became stoical. The mother's distress by unwanted pregnancy is, to me, he says, the primary consideration ahead of any possible consideration for the fetus. Somebody has to do it, and unfortunately, we are the executioners. And those are his words, a doctor's words, a doctor who has taken the Hippocratic oath. This is from Performing Abortion by Dr. Magda Deans in Commentary, October 1976, pages 35 and 37. Confessions of an Abortionist, a doctor who goes on to drag in the thousands of dollars so he can go out on Sunday and play golf or go yachting or go deep-sea fishing. It's a loveless world out there, brethren, that we face. And we better realize it and not have affection for the world itself and its customs. Love is an essential ingredient to any unborn child's health and development. Now I'm quoting from The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, the book by Dr. Thomas Burney, and on the flap of it was a condensation, and I'm going to quote that. By the single act of positive reinforcement, on the other hand, now he's talking about the other side of the coin, by the single act of positive reinforcement, by the joyful act of dwelling in her thoughts on the baby she is carrying, she can influence her child in remarkably beneficial ways. Remember what Malachi 4, verse 6 says? This church, this body of believers, is to be engaged in turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, and turning the hearts of the children to the fathers. Now, a mother plays, I quoted, or I referred to, this mother who played music. It happened to be that she was playing cello music, but she played it only while she was preparing for a specific program that was an unusual program, but she was doing it while she was pregnant with her son. And she never again played that music. But later he becomes a concert director and finds that he knows the music before he ever heard it played. And he had never heard it played since his birth. Never once. And his mother, when she finds out about it, recalls that she played it while she was bearing him. So does he live? Does he learn? Is he just a piece of tissue in his mother's womb? Or is he a thinking being, a feeling, a sensitive being? Another mother plans to abort her daughter in uterus. And I read this account 2 weeks ago. The mother planned to abort her daughter, Christina, to do it in utero. But her husband persuaded her not to abort it. And so the child is born. And when the child is born, instantly it rejected the source of its food from its own mother's breast and refused to take the food, but would take another mother's breast eagerly, in fact, voraciously. The thoughts of the mother, and even talking about abortion, affected the uterus, the unborn child in the mother's uterus. Have we ever thought of these things when we raised our children or conceived our children, you parents out there? Have we thought how much our thoughts and our actions played in the behavior of our children later on? The accounts in some of the research show a man that had all kinds of psychological problems, and the doctors could not find and discover why he had those problems. He seemed to have everything going for himself. But under medication, they got him to recount his past. And he discovered that he could understand many things that were taking place. Even in the womb, he could recall being in the womb of his mother. And also, that while he was in the womb, knowing that his mother did not want him, but the father was persuading the mother to go ahead and have the baby. The baby struggled. The baby refused, apparently, the proper nourishment. How? Doctors aren't able to discover today, even the researchers. They know that it happened. And the child even heard the doctors cursing because they had put the mother under ether, and she had stopped bearing down as they wanted her to do. So the doctors were cursing and swearing and trying to figure out how to get the baby, and they finally took the baby with forceps, but the baby was so close to death at that time that they called in a priest, and the priest administered last rites. And this is one of the things this man had recalling in his mind. And when he finally got a hold of his mother and talked to her about it, I guess it was the researcher that did it, got a hold of the mother, and the mother said yes. She had not wanted the baby. It was a difficult birth. The child was born nearly dead. The doctors were, according to her husband, cursing and swearing and trying to get the baby out alive. And then they had called in a priest to administer last rites, but the child lived miraculously in spite of all of the trauma. Now, how does all of this tie in? We find that a Chinese couple is reported to have brought forth what everyone who saw their child called a genius. This was over in Hong Kong. They were a well-educated couple. He was a professor at the university, some university in Hong Kong, and his wife also was a graduate and a teacher. So they began to teach their unborn child in utero. It doesn't say when they started, and they began to teach simple little words and repeat those words to the child. I'm going to say something about repetition a little later, hopefully. And the mother sang a little nursery rhyme, something that goes similar to our "Ba Ba Black Sheep, Have You Any Wool" song. I can't sing, so I can't. My mother didn't teach me to sing in the womb. Now, here was the amazing thing. 3 hours after that child's birth, the nurse in the pediatric ward was going down the rows of the young babies in their cribs, and she heard a voice speaking. And it wasn't an adult voice, it was a child's voice. She looked under the cots, and there were no children that had sneaked into the nursery. And she was puzzled and walked up and down the rows, and finally she came to this one crib next to the last in the row, and she heard it again. She looked all around. There was no child, no adult in the room but herself. She looked over into the crib, and there was a smiling little Chinese boy's face, 3 hours old. And his eyes were bright, and he looked on her, and he said in Chinese, "Mama?" 3 hours old. She couldn't believe it. In fact, she was horrified, frightened, and she raced out of the nursery, clamored for the doctor and the nurse came back in. When they came back in, the little child was reciting, "Ba Ba Black Sheep, Have You Any Wool?" in song, in Chinese song, a similar song in Chinese. They called in the psychiatrist. The doctor got his camera, and I guess a recorder, and he recorded this. And by the time this child was 3 months old, his vocabulary was proven to be that of a 7-year-old child. How much can we do for our children? How much can we yet do in God's church? As the children of God, God is trying to teach us. God is saying over and over to us, isn't he, through his word, the right way to go. How many of us have internalized what God is saying and are acting on what God is saying? There are many evidences in late research that the child in utero is not some insignificant tissue, unconcerned with attitude of father and mother. Now, the father has a great deal to play in all of this. Evidence further shows that in the last 25 years of research, many of the adults who have psychological problems in adjusting to society, they can't adjust to society. And all of it is a direct result of neglecting the teaching and the bonding in utero, as they say, in the uterus by the parents before the child ever comes to the age of birth. There is concern in that tiny developing mind, whether we realize it or not, there is concern in that embryo and fetus. Have we planned to abort a child, any of us, and then changed our minds later? But has it damaged that child when it came to birth? The child seems to know in utero, and it puts that child in a trauma. And it begins to develop an attitude in that child toward its own mother and its own father. An unwanted pregnancy? How many of us in our families have had unwanted pregnancy? That unwanted pregnancy in the mother's womb knows that it is in a hostile, angry woman and mother, woman that's supposed to be his mother, and even is known to withdraw, quote, withdraw his physiological support, thereby harming himself. Could this be called fetal suicide, where the child doesn't want to be born and has sort of pulled itself back from all of the physiological support? That's a big question now in these researchers, trying to figure out what has brought about some of the harm that has been done to individuals after they have been born. And if nothing more, those unwanted pregnancies have turned out generally to be very difficult deliveries for the mother. Why? Because the child is not cooperating their discovery with the mother in her contractions and so forth. So why not teach? I have a little article here. Unfortunately, I don't know where it came from. I received, after preaching 2 weeks ago, all manner of literature. I've got whole sheets of it here, which I won't be able to get into, and I don't think there's any need to get into it. All I want to do is spark your attention to some factors that will enhance this church from here on in and help us to develop the kind of generation of young people to serve in God's Word. This article says, unborn babies love to hear moms reading poetry. Psychologist Dr. Tony DeCasper of the University of North Carolina in Charlotte had 16 expectant women recite the children's rhyming story, The Cat in the Hat, by Dr. Seuss, I guess it is, twice a day for the last 6 months of pregnancy. Twice a day for 6 months. Recited that story, the rhyming story, The Cat in the Hat. And after their babies were born, the infants instantly recognized the rhyme and reacted to it when it was read again by their mothers. To test the intensity of their reaction, Dr. DeCasper devised a suckling test. When Dr. Seuss's story was read to them, the babies suckled more frequently and with more obvious pleasure. The psychologist says the test confirms that babies can hear while they are in the womb and learn before they are born. Now, my question is, why go to Dr. Seuss when we have so much material that we could begin to instruct our little infant in the womb? Why go to Dr. Seuss? We have records of that kind. Why not teach some of the simple proverbs or the simple psalms, and perhaps take some of our hymnals that are simple and sing them? Sit in a rocking chair, you expectant mothers, and sing some of your favorite hymns from God's hymnal. So we can teach God's hymns by selecting out simple ones and say them over and over, sing them over and over again. We could do the same with the Psalms, with the Proverbs. Now there's a quote from the Unborn. This quote that I've given you shows that they have proved Now, how many babies were there? I forget the number. I think it was 16. 16, and every one of them responded. Now, I thought they should have had a control group of some that didn't have that, and put them side by side, and then play that rhyming song and see if the control group who hadn't heard it would respond in the same way. And I'm positive in my mind that they would not. So unborn babies love to hear mums reading poetry, perhaps singing songs. Talk to them constantly. I've mentioned the supersuicidic kids article. I understand it was on television, and I missed that. I wish I could have seen that because it's very inspiring. But I have the article, Supersuicidic Kids, from the Families magazine from June 1982. And the article is written by Sally Bell, who interviewed the suicidics. And in that, they show they had an 11-year-old, I have it here somewhere if I can dig it out, an 11-year-old child. It says, "Can you teach your child to be a genius?" "Yes," say this remarkable couple, who back their claim with proof positive. 4 brilliant daughters, including a 11-year-old college freshman for whom learning is child's play. And all of the things that child is learning in college at 11 years of age staggers my mind. Because as an adult now, I cannot delve into some of the things that she was taking so easily, and simply because their parents were intelligent enough to try an experiment and begin to train them even before they were born. And then as soon as they were born, they began to instruct them so that they could speak. One child, I think they said, I could read the article, but I don't want to take the time. My time runs out so rapidly. They taught their child to speak words, not quite like the Chinese child, but within 1 month, each child was saying mama. And by 3 months, could say quite a number of words similar to what the Chinese child was doing. They said one child didn't learn to develop a vocabulary until 3.5 months. It was a little bit retarded. 3.5 months. But could carry on a conversation after that, understandably, with adults. Now, they could not write because they don't have the motor control to learn to write. But they could identify, they could add, they could multiply, they could identify colors by the time they were 3 or 4 months old. Some of us may have worked that way with our children, and maybe unbeknownst to me or Dr. Hay or anybody else, we have geniuses in our midst that we don't know. But I doubt that very many of you have worked with your children in that way. The supersuicidic kids were normal in every case. When they got away from their studies, they went out and played with their friends in the neighborhood just like any other child. They loved their dolls. They loved the kind of play. They were not twisted in their minds. They had wonderful, shy personalities. For all of their wisdom and knowledge that they had picked up, they were still. But the suicidics have made the statement on page 97 of this article, there should not be boring repetition, particularly after birth. Repetition is boring to a child, something I never knew before. I thought by repeating, and they absolutely go against the school's principles of teaching by repetition. Have you ever talked to children and tried to get them to study the Bible with you? And you come to something that you've passed before, and suddenly the child is looking around, disinterested. The supersuicidic kids quickly conveyed to their parents the principle that there should not be boring repetition, particularly after birth. The first days home from the hospital are critical. Within 3 days, they started on a practice of saying something to the children in simple terms, but they would not repeat it. Why? Because the child would get bored and look away and look back at the parents as though to say, look, you've already told me that. Let's get on to something else. You can bore your children by repetition is what they are holding out. Now, I'd like to see some of our young parents try this and see how successful they are in raising children of this kind. But how blind has Satan made our society? Satan has succeeded in blinding our society, hasn't he? Terribly. God has told us that we, like the unborn child in the womb, just have not seen clearly. And there, amazingly, is that word of God in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12, where it says, we see through a glass darkly. God has told us that. Can we clear up that glass and begin to look at things in a clearer light? We are being led by God to a light that is blinding to the rest of the people in the world. When they understand the things that we understand in the light of God's truth, we blind those people. And they don't like that bright light. And they reject it. Just as Mr. McClung was bringing out in his sermonette. We humanly don't like to be corrected. We are being led by God to an understanding that staggers the people in the world. And because it staggers them, they can't grasp it. And they will not grasp it. They will never grasp it until God draws them to Jesus Christ. And it's only through Jesus Christ that they're going to be drawn to that light, to that way of life, to these staggering truths and understandings that we are privileged to have in God's church. We have a tremendous responsibility. We've suffered, brethren. We have deprived ourselves of some of the greatest blessings that could come to humanity. And it's all been there in God's Word, actually. I think the scripture that I used 2 weeks ago in Romans, this 8th chapter, this is a marvelous chapter anyway in the Bible. Paul's writing in Romans, the 8th chapter. There's so much in this 8th chapter, but in verse 9, he said, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. Then in verse 11 it says, but if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you, which dwells in you. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. That's the way we have lived. That's the way the whole world is living. I was sorry to hear that Mr. McClung lived that way, according to the flesh, most of his life. But then he was speaking for all of us as well. We too have lived according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. And Satan is going to see that you die, and see that these unborn children are going to continue to die. Well, I've been speaking to you today, thousands of tiny little fetuses and embryos have been snuffed out of their opportunity of life. Well, I've been speaking to you today. It's going on, and there's a big battle being fought. The pro-abortionist versus the anti-abortionist. They're all struggling to bring their points out. The pro-abortionists are trying to deceive the world into believing that that's nothing but a tissue, a growing tissue in the mother's womb, and can be kept there and developed, or it can be easily taken away with no harm to anything. I have one account here that I want to read. It's not going to be pleasant, among all the others I could bring. Susan Lindstrom, MSW, whatever that means, age 27, puts it this way, quote, and this is again from Children, Things We Throw Away by Melody Green. Susan Lindstrom says, I am having a lot of difficulty with my feelings about late abortions and all the pain that's there so much of the time after the baby is moving. So one day, in need to arrive at a measure of clarity, I went into the room where they keep the fetuses before burning them. They were next to the garbage cans in paper buckets, like the take-home chicken kind. I looked inside the bucket in front of me. There was a small naked person in there, floating in a bloody liquid. He was purple with bruises, and his face had the agonized tautness of one forced to die too soon. I then took the lid off the lids of all the buckets, and with a pair of forceps lifted each fetus out by an arm or a leg, leaving as I returned them an additional bruise on their acid-soaked bodies. Finally, I lifted out a very large fetus and read the labels. Mother's name, C. Atkins. Doctor's name, Saul Marcus. Sex of the item, see, it's just an item. It's just a tissue. Sex of the item, male. Time of gestation, 24 weeks. 6 months old in the womb. I remembered Miss Atkins. She was 17, a very pretty blonde girl. So, this was Master Atkins, to be burned tomorrow for the sake of his mother. As I said, this is going on while I yet speak. Thousands that God intends to have in his family. We have the opportunity, brethren, of turning all society around. Not yet, but we should be doing our utmost to get behind God's apostle and the drive to get this great commission taken care of. Reading on now in Romans, the 8th chapter, beginning in verse 16, the Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. These were all the children of God. This Master Atkins is still a child of God, I'm sure. What happens to him in the resurrection, I don't know. But we know that he has the Spirit in man in him, given there at the very moment of conception in the mother's womb. And if children then, verse 17, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And I emphasized this 2 weeks ago, and I emphasize it again. For the earnest expectation of the creation of all of these tiny embryos and fetuses that are extant in mothers' wombs all around this world today. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. You are the sons of God. Your children are the sons of God that are going to turn this world around, this society around. It's not going to turn the world around. It's going to have a part in destroying the systems of this world and setting up with Christ the wonderful world tomorrow. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, vanity, uselessness, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. And not only they, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the, it says, adoption or the birth, the redemption of our body. For we were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. And, as Mr. McClung brought out, the Spirit is going to help us in our weaknesses. It says, the Spirit makes intercession for us with groanings, in verse 26, which cannot be uttered. Verse 28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that we might be the firstborn among many brethren. Now, we have suffered. Many of us are too old to relive our lives. But we can all have the great joy derived from seeing this present generation that we have growing up in our midst rise to greater heights of achievement than we could ever imagine before. To the wonderful happiness in the generations to come, we are fulfilling through this, then, Malachi 4 in verse 6. Turning the hearts of the fathers, Mr. Armstrong has inspired the church to realize, turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the children's hearts to their fathers. So I'd like to exhort all of you to keep your eyes on our young people. Watch what they're doing. See how they're developing and fine-tuning the character that you and I failed to develop when we were young like that. Come out and see the volleyball, for instance, tomorrow morning that begins at 9:30, right here in the gymnasium. I know you've got lawns to mow, cars to wash, windows to wash, floors to mop, maybe a golf course to walk across, chasing a little white ball. But come out and watch the YOU girls volleyball. 7 churches of girls, over 100 girls are involved in this. And they have made marvelous progress in character development and sportsmanship. Keep your eyes on our young people, on the YOU, and those that are even younger, the little ones that are toddling around. Take time for them. I see so many of you just sort of kind of brush aside the little ones that are around from knees on down. Take time to take note of their new shoes, the pretty dress they have on, or the beautiful tie the boy has on, or the way the hair is cut and trimmed. All of these are changing. Are you changing with them? Are you keeping pace with our young people? And are you helping them? Your presence in those bleachers right over there at these activities of our young people so inspire them. Well, we start out at 9:30, and usually there are about 15 or 20, perhaps, scattered across those 3 racks of benches over there. Where are the rest of you? Oh, you don't have children, do you? Are you going to encourage the oncoming generation that's going to have a tremendous role in changing the kingdom? Think about it, and be with our young people all the way.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.